Three experienced lighthouse keepers disappear from a locked island. No signs of violence, no bodies, no wreckage, no final message. On December 26, 1900, a man named Joseph Moore stepped onto a lighthouse island expecting to be met at the dock. No one was there. He found a spotless kitchen, made beds, and lamps ready for the night. But the three keepers who lived there were gone, and one man's coat, the only one he ever wore, was still hanging on its peg. I am Lady Moonveil. Let's find out why he left without it. Before we get to the coat, we need to talk about where it was hanging. Because the place matters here almost as much as the people. 21 miles off the coast of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, there's a small cluster of rock the old sailors call the Seven Hunters. The largest of them is the Aileen Moor, Gaelic for Big Island, which is a bit of a stretch, honestly, since the whole thing is barely large enough to stand on comfortably. Steep hills, constant wind, and an Atlantic that doesn't calm down for long. For centuries, local fishermen avoided staying there overnight, not out of practicality, out of belief. The story passed down along that coast involved the Blue Men of the Munich, sea spirits said to live in the churning water between the islands, blamed for storms that seemed to come from nowhere and swallow ships whole. When the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to build a lighthouse on Aileen Moor in the 1980s, some of the men who worked the construction reportedly felt they were building somewhere they weren't entirely welcome. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further. I'm not going to lean on that folklore to explain what happened here. It's real history, it's worth knowing, and it tells you something true about how this coastline was regarded long before 1900. But the actual case doesn't need sea spirits to be unsettling. What actually happened on that rock is strange enough on its own, and every piece of it is documented. The lighthouse was completed in the 1899, one of the last built by the Stevenson family's engineering firm, the same family responsible for lighthouses up and down the Scottish coast. It was staffed year-round by 3 keepers at a time, rotating in and out on relief boats whenever weather allowed, which on that stretch of coast wasn't often. So keep that in mind as we go. This isn't a story about an unknowable place. It's a story about 3 very real, very experienced men in one of the most isolated postings in the country. And what happened to them still doesn't fully add up. Let's talk about who these men actually were, because I think it matters. James Ducat was the principal keeper, 43 years old, married with 4 children waiting for him on the mainland. He'd been with the Northern Lighthouse Board for over 20 years by that point, moving between postings, eventually earning the promotion to principal. His daughter, decades later, remembered him kissing each of his children goodbye before leaving for that final posting, and said she always wondered afterward if some part of him knew he wasn't coming back. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant, younger, unmarried, and by most accounts steady and reliable. The kind of keeper you'd want next to you during a long isolated winter. And Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, meaning he wasn't permanently assigned to Aileen Moor. He was filling in for a keeper on sick leave. MacArthur had a reputation as tough, physically capable, and not particularly given to nerves, married with children of his own. 3 professionals, no history of conflict between them. No signs in any prior report that anything about this posting was unusual, which is worth sitting with for a second, because it rules out a version of the story that would actually be easier to explain. 3 men who didn't get along, trapped together too long. That's not what the record shows. What the record shows is 3 capable men doing a job they knew well on an island they'd worked before, which makes what comes next harder to make sense of, not easier. On the night of December 15, 1900, a steamship called the Arctur was making its way from Philadelphia to the port of Leith. Somewhere along that route, its path took it past Aileen Moor, and the crew noted something in their log. The lighthouse wasn't lit. That's not a small detail to a ship's crew. A dark lighthouse on a night like that is exactly the kind of thing that gets a ship wrecked. But the Arctur didn't dock until 3 days later. Only then did word reach the Northern Lighthouse Board that something might be wrong at Aileen Moor. Here's where the story gets its first real gap, one that had nothing to do with what happened on the island itself. The weather over the following days was too violent to send a relief ship out safely, so for over a week nobody could get near that lighthouse to check. Think about that stretch of time. Somewhere on that rock, something had already gone wrong. We just don't know yet what, or exactly when, and the mainland could do nothing but wait for a break in the weather. That break didn't come until December 26th, 11 days after the Arctur first noted the darkness. The relief ship Hesperus, captained by Jim Harvey, finally reached Aileen Moor that morning. Aboard was Joseph Moore, the relief keeper coming to take his rotation expecting an ordinary handover. Standard procedure at Aileen Moor was for a signal to be raised at the landing whenever a boat approached. Nothing was raised. Harvey sounded the ship's horn, no response. He had a rocket flare sent up, bright enough to be seen from anywhere on that small island. Still nothing. Moore was put ashore alone. He made his way up the steps cut into the cliffside, over 100 of them, toward the lighthouse compound at the top. When he reached it, he found both the outer gate and the main door closed. Not broken, not forced, just closed. The way you'd leave them if you meant to come back shortly. He went inside. I want to pause here because this is the exact moment where every account of this case either gets exaggerated into something it wasn't or gets told honestly. I'm going to tell you the honest version. Moore didn't walk into chaos. He walked into a lighthouse that looked, at first glance, completely ordinary. That's actually the part that should unsettle you more. Inside, the beds were unmade, as if the men had simply gotten up that morning and never come back to them. The clocks had stopped, not shattered, not tampered with, just stopped, the way any clock stops and nobody's left to wind it. When more men came ashore to search properly, they found the kitchen tidy. The lamps had been cleaned, refilled, and prepared for that night's light. Meaning whatever happened before the evening's work was done, not during some moment of neglect. These were men still doing their jobs, right up until they weren't. And then there was the detail that's followed this case for over a century. Two of the men, Ducat and Marshall, had left fully dressed for the weather. Sea boots, oilskins, by the book, exactly as protocol required if you were heading down toward the landing in bad conditions. Donald MacArthur's coat was still on its peg. Moore knew that detail meant something specific, because he'd served alongside MacArthur before. In his statement to the investigation, he said plainly that MacArthur never wore any other coat, not once. On any prior occasion, this wasn't a guess. It was a co-worker telling investigators exactly what he'd personally witnessed, day after day on that same rock. So sit with that for a second. In the middle of a violent December storm, an experienced keeper who never went anywhere without that coat went out without it. What could make a careful man skip the one thing he never skips? The search moved outside, down toward the western landing, the side of the island most exposed to the open Atlantic. And that's where the evidence turns from confusing to genuinely violent. An iron railing bolted into solid rock along the path had been torn from its foundation and bent out of shape. A section of railway track, the kind used to haul supplies up from the boats, had been ripped clean out of its concrete base. A block of stone weighing over a ton had been dislodged and carried down into the path. And higher up, more than 60 meters above sea level, the turf itself had been torn away from the cliff edge. A supply box anchored well above the normal reach of the tide had been smashed apart, its contents scattered. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent who arrived a few days later to lead the official investigation, had personally recruited all three of these men. He knew them, and his conclusion, based on everything he found, was that the two dressed keepers had likely gone down to secure equipment at the western landing during the storm. A job these men had done countless times before, and been caught by a wave large enough to sweep them off the rocks. But Muirhead's own report includes something people tend to skip over. The wind that night was blowing from the west. By his own reasoning, that should have pushed anyone swept from the landing back up onto the island, not out to the sea. He wrote that down himself and didn't fully resolve it. No bodies were ever recovered, not from the landing, not along the coastline, not in the weeks or months of searching that followed. And one more thing, because it matters for what people have claimed about this case ever since. Years later, a story circulated that the keeper's final logbook entries described a storm unlike any they'd seen. One man silent, another in tears, all three praying, ending with the words, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." It's a haunting image. It's also fiction. Later research confirmed these entries were never actually written, invented well after the fact to make a strange case feel even stranger. I'm telling you that not to take anything away from this story, but because the true version doesn't need the embellishment. It's unsettling enough as it is. So what actually happened out there? Let's look at what's been proposed, and where each one runs into a problem it can't quite get past. The first theory involves something other than the sea entirely, smugglers, or a naval incident, with the keeper's silence to keep them quiet. It's a compelling idea, mostly because Aileen Moore does sit along a route ships used, but it runs straight into the evidence inside the lighthouse. Nothing was disturbed, nothing was stolen. Whoever secures a scene that carefully after removing 3 witnesses is being remarkably tidy about it. And there's no evidence anyone else was ever on that island at all. The second theory turns inward, toward the men themselves. 3 people, isolated for weeks, tempers fraying under pressure, and MacArthur, known for a harder edge, at the center of it. Under this theory, something breaks between them, and what's left is one man, alone, unable to live with what happened. It's psychologically plausible. but it doesn't explain the western landing. That damage, the torn railing, the shattered box, the ton of displaced stone is storm damage, not the aftermath of a fight between three men in a lighthouse kitchen. The third theory is the one most investigators then and now have leaned toward. Ducat and Marshall go down to the landing to secure equipment, as they'd done before. A wave, larger than expected, powerful enough to move stone, catches them. MacArthur, watching from above, sees it happen and runs, without stopping for his coat, to try to help, and the sea takes him too. I find this one the most likely, but it has the same hole Muirhead couldn't close in his own report. The wind that night should have pushed anyone swept off these rocks back onto the island, not away from it. And even setting that aside, there's a piece that no theory fully accounts for. 3 trained keepers, strict protocol required at least one person to remain in the lighthouse at all times, without exception. It's the first rule any of them would have known. And for that night, for reasons nobody's ever been able to explain, all 3 of them broke it. Here's what I keep coming back to with this case. Not the storm, not the cliffs, the rule. These weren't inexperienced men caught off guard by isolation. They were professionals who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how dangerous that coastline could be, and the one instruction built specifically to protect against a night like that. Someone always stays inside is the one thing all 3 of them apparently ignored. We can build a reasonable case for how each of them ended up outside. What we can't fully explain is why none of them stayed. Muirhead closed his investigation labeling it an accident, and every piece of physical evidence supports that conclusion far more than it supports anything stranger. I think that's almost certainly what happened here. 3 men, doing dangerous, familiar work, caught by conditions violent enough to move stone. There's nothing supernatural required to explain Eileen more, but an accident doesn't automatically mean every detail fits together neatly. It just means we've settled on the least impossible explanation for what's left. So I'll leave you with this. Ducat and Marshall dressed for the weather and went down to do a job they'd done many times. Fine. But MacArthur, the one man who, by protocol, should have simply stayed inside and watched, didn't have time to grab a coat he never went anywhere without. Whatever he saw through that window, it moved him faster than instinct, faster than training, and faster than 100 years of protocol built specifically to keep one man on that island, safe no matter what happened outside. I don't think that detail is supernatural. I think it's human. But I also don't think it's fully explained. Tell me what you think happened out there. I'll be reading every comment. Until next time.